way this is going to work, if anyone's played the weekly New York Times news quiz, you know basically how this goes. I have a series of questions I'm going to ask, and you have the answer sheets at your table. And if you could have one person be the official answer recorder for the table, that would be great. Because I'm going to collect them afterwards and see how you did. All right? Let's get started. This is a time test, by the way. Yeah. All right, so here's your first question. And I'm going to read it for you just in case it's a little hard to read that, I'm sure it is. So, air bubbles trapped in ice show that for 800,000 years up to about 1900, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere ranged from 200 to 300 parts per million. Since 1900, carbon dioxide levels have increased over 50% to 425 parts per million, primarily from burning fossil fuels. So the question is, what is happening to global greenhouse gas emissions during the last 10 years? And the answers are possibly emissions have started to decline, emissions have plateaued, emissions are still rising but at a somewhat slower rate, or emissions are still rising at the same rate. So you get a minute to confer as a group, and then we'll talk about that question a little bit. All right, time's up. Why don't the official table recorder just jot down your answer, and let's talk about this for a second. So the answer to this question is C. All right, we've made a little progress on this, but we've got a lot of work to do. Let me get your attention to front here, and I want to point out a couple of things. So this is what temperature change and carbon dioxide levels look like over 800,000 years. And again, they know this from the little bubbles that get trapped in ice cores. And this chart shows the change in temperature on the left side, that's the red line. And on the right side, we show the change in the level of carbon dioxide. And you can see those lines track very closely. The thing that's been happening over time is due to some just natural cycles. The fluctuations have been they were around 280, or the top level was around 280. The level was probably somewhere around 225 on average. And they went up and down. We had a period where the Earth was a lot warmer, about 100,000 years ago, right here, where sea level was between 5 and 10 meters higher than it is now. And, you know, that was when carbon dioxide levels were around 280. So obviously things have changed a lot because we are now here, right? And it's all happened in the past 120 years. About 1900, scientists already knew what the greenhouse gas effect was. And they had, one of them, Nobel Prize winner Svante Arrhenius, had predicted that if you double the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, global temperatures would be 5 to 6 degrees centigrade higher. And then by 1960, they were starting to measure it on Mauna Loa, and they could see the changes happening. And they predicted that by about 1990, it would be about 22% higher, which it was about 25%. So we've known exactly what this phenomenon is, and it's been quite predictable what the change in temperature would be, and now we're up here. So kind of the question is, you know, what's going to happen next? All right, next question.
Jeff?
Yeah?
That graph didn't, I couldn't see the things at the bottom, but it didn't show the last 10 years, did it? Because I was thinking, first my answer was C, but then I was thinking the last 10 years it probably hasn't changed that much.
No, the level keeps going up. Carbon dioxide level keeps going up.
But
the changes
about emissions from cars.
Yeah, it's so fast you can't see it. This scale is out 800,000 years, and it's all happened right in the past 100. So you can't even see that change. It's so fast, right? And that's a big shock to the climate system. All right. Question. Whoops, I went back. Question 2. So, which of the following climate records were set in 2023? And you have them in front of you, so I'm not going to read them. It's a pretty long list. I encourage you to just go through and see which ones you think happened during the past year. All right, time's up. I'm curious what some of you thought on this one. How about this table here?
We didn't get very far.
You didn't get that far? Okay.
But
You got up through E and you thought all of those have happened? Yeah, well, that is true. In fact, this is kind of a leading question because every one of these things happened. Every one of these records happened in the past year. And that's kind of the point. And a couple of things I want to point out about this list. First of all, there's a lot happening in the ocean because the ocean to date has absorbed most of the increase in all that thermal energy that's been accumulating on the planet. The absorption of that has mostly happened in the ocean. And the ocean has been this great big reservoir of coolness that's kind of saved us from a lot of rapid increase in air temperature. But the ocean's starting to reach its limit. And it's causing a lot of damage. Just right now, we have our 4th global coral bleaching event happening. And the coral are dying. And they can't take too much more of this. And we're doing the best we can to try and find coral who are surviving and see if we can breed more of them. But we can't change fast enough. The coral can't change fast enough. So like the Great Barrier Reef is going to die. And there are a lot of ecologies or ecosystems around the planet where people depend on the food chain that starts with the corals. They live off the fish, that's where they get their protein. And that's going to be a big problem. Another point about this is that a couple of these records are cold records, like record snow and record cold in Boston. That's because the biggest and most obvious change in weather is just more extremes of everything. And you really can't go almost, it seems, a week without reading about some major happening with weather these days. This is just a few of the headlines from the past year. And we even have new words now that we're using in our lexicon, things like heat domes and atmospheric rivers, polar vortex, bomb cyclones. These are all relatively new terms to describe these severe episodes of weather that are happening around the planet. So we're in trouble. This stuff is going to happen more and more as we go forward. And I think what we'll start to see is more of acceleration of air temperature now, since the ocean is sort of reaching a limit as to how much it can save us.
Jeff?
Yep.
Could you explain why the average temperature over 12 months exceeded the 1.5 C IPCC limit?
Yeah, so the IPCC is the International Panel on Climate Change. It's tens of thousands of scientists who specialize in climate change, and they collectively have been tracking changes and making recommendations now about what we need to do to address this crisis. And they have told us, based on what they know, that we have to cut our emissions globally 50% by 2030 to avoid exceeding a 1.5 degree change on average in our climate. Well, it's starting already to happen, and we aren't slowing down. So, the changes are just going to get more severe.
So does that mean 1.5 degrees Celsius change?
Yeah, increase.
Increase.
So on average during 2023, we hit that level.
Can you tell us Fahrenheit, please? Most of us don't think.
Yeah, so what? 3.1 degrees or something like that? 2, multiplied by roughly 2.
3.2.
1.8 times.
Yeah. Okay, next question.
Number 3.
All right, feedback loops are changes in the environment that increase or decrease the level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Scientists worry that more greenhouse gases will trigger feedback loops and cause a global temperature to jump to a much higher equilibrium. So a feedback loop can be either be something that amplifies the change in greenhouse gas emissions, or it can be something that slows it down, that works the other direction. So I've made a list here of some of the feedback loops that scientists are tracking. And the question that I'd like you to answer is, which of these feedback loops amplify warming, in other words, make warming happen faster, and are already happening? All right, time's up. Let's talk about this one for a second. So the answer is every one of these changes, except one, amplifies the rate of change in global warming. And the one that doesn't do that, that actually works the other direction, is E. So plants grow a little faster when they have more carbon dioxide in the air. And that would tend to slow down the change. However, all the other changes make global warming happen faster. And every one of them is happening at some level. You know, you probably read mostly about changes in ice levels, for example, in the Arctic. That's definitely happening, and it's been happening for a long time. We're losing glaciers. There's a lot less snow cover. And so that, because the snow is white, it reflects better and sends some of that solar radiation back out into space. If you think about the ocean, it's dark, and so if a lot more of the ocean is exposed, it absorbs that light spectrum and tends to heat up faster. So that's part of one example. Wildfires, another example. Primarily, it works both directions, but primarily it destroys plants, so they can't consume carbon dioxide. And the same thing with forests dying back, and insect outbreaks that kill trees that then don't consume carbon dioxide. So all of those changes are already happening, and I want to.
What about J?
J, which one was J?
Yeah, reduction in aerosol pollution.
Oh yeah, thank you. That one's a little different than the others. It's kind of ironic. We have slowed down the rate of gain of solar radiation a little bit from our pollution. It's kind of works like a volcano in that sense, right? We get particulates in the atmosphere that have absorbed some of the radiation that would otherwise reach the surface. So ironically, as we clean up our energy system, there's a little bit of a feedback loop that will cause more solar radiation to be accumulated. So the main thing I want people to take away from this is that we just have continued to increase the level of emissions every year. It keeps piling up, and it stays there for hundreds of years. I'm not sure I know the exact number, how long it takes for the carbon dioxide to break down. And every one of these changes will make that happen more quickly. So it just increases the urgency for us to change. All right, next question. Question number 4. People in North America produce more greenhouse gas emissions per capita than anyone in the world. Compared to the 60% of the global population living in the southern hemisphere, how much more emissions do we produce per capita? And you can see the numbers range from 2 times, 3 times, 5 times, 7 times, 9 times. Who needs more time? Anyone? Looks like it looks like we got this one figured out. I'm curious, what did this table think?
We were kind of all over the board, somewhere between 5 and...
Well, you have to pick one.
No, we have 4 different votes here. That's the way we work.
So an average?
Five.
So like 5? Okay.
7.
Anyone else?
Maybe a good
Dick?
compromise.
5?
Between 9 and 6.
9.
It's 9. Yeah. On average, and I think I have a slide that shows this. Okay, so you remember we talked a moment ago about how the scientific community has a consensus that we need to cut our emissions globally. This purple line is the global emissions per person. Globally, we need to reduce them to something like per person to like 2.3 out here in 2030. And that's because we will have a few more people at that time too. So in comparison to the global average, the 60% of the people that live below the equator on average produce 2 tons of greenhouse gas emissions per person per year. And you may remember a ton, think of a big bubble that is 30 feet in diameter. That's a ton of carbon dioxide at sea level. So we, on the other hand, produce roughly 18 tons per person per year. And in contrast, the European Union is down here at around, was it 18? Yeah. China's at around 6.5. And this is an interesting case study. Sweden is down around 4. And you know, their economy is as developed as ours. They are per capita global. Their GDP per capita is similar to ours. Their economies outperformed ours over 20 years. It's a productive, wealthy society. How have they done that? Well, they had some advantages because they have a fair amount of water around, so they get a lot of hydropower. They've done a lot with nuclear, as have other countries like France and Canada. They also were the first in the world to put a tax on emissions that covered not just a few big polluters, but everybody pretty much. There were fees on greenhouse gas emissions that affected households and small businesses, large businesses, and they started that in the late 90s. And naturally, people over time started adopting solutions that brought down their greenhouse gas emissions. It hasn't had any negative impact on their economy. Question?
Well, and both Sweden and Europe have better train systems than we do.
They have lots of things that are different, and that's one of them, yeah.
People ride public transportation more there.
Yeah, they do. They have better public transport.
I wonder how much population density, per square area, what kilometers, square mile has something to do.
That's definitely a factor. I mean, it's easier to have shared services like mass transit if you have density.
In Europe,
Yeah.
whereas in the United States.
But the biggest factor by far, though, is wealth. If you have more money, you consume more, and that has a bigger greenhouse gas footprint to it. Because there are people in all societies that are consuming at that level. It's just that we're the wealthiest, so we consume more. And there's a lot of discussion about trying to get, everybody has to contribute to bringing the greenhouse gas emissions down, but the 67% of the people in the world can't, and they don't want to. They want to live like we do. And they think it's inherently unfair that we've filled the atmosphere with greenhouse gas emissions, and now we're asking them to contribute to solving the problem when we created it. So, yeah.
Just interesting to see the dip during COVID years.
Yep, there was a little bit of a dip during COVID, and then it popped right back up.
But it's because, air travel was largely curtailed.
Yeah. Well, we could see it from our house. You could see the improvement in the air quality. That little brown layer of haze was gone for a while. Yeah. And cars, airplanes too. Everything was, all sorts of transit were much lower during the onset of COVID. So, next question. Clean energy solutions have improved in performance and declined in cost dramatically in the past 10 years. Which of these statements about clean energy solutions are true? And there are 4 of them, and we've got them right in front of you there. All right, time's up. I'm curious, over here by the recording device.
All of them?
All of the above. All of them.
Not D. D is not true. Now this is a trick question. D is a tricky question because the first part of that sentence is true. The last 4 words are no longer true.
And
Heat pumps have improved enough recently that they are more efficient everywhere.
and that's changed in the last 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, probably about 5 years ago. There are places, utilities in places like Vermont that are putting in tons of heat pumps. Now, efficient doesn't always mean cheaper to operate. If you happen to be in a place that has really cheap gas, and it's cold, and you have really expensive electricity, it might still be less costly on an annual basis to continue using your gas furnace, except for the fact that you're valuing the cost of the pollution at 0. You know, if you count that at 0, yeah, it might make sense to keep using it. But if you assign any cost to the pollution that comes from a gas boiler, you should be switching to a heat pump.
Number C, isn't that why the electric cars are selling so fast anymore? That it costs a lot more?
Well, so electric vehicles have been on a falling price point steadily for a long time. They have leveled out a bit, except there's a big breakthrough that's about to happen. I don't know if we'll be allowed to have it in this country. Company BYD in China, that is a really big company that makes batteries among other things, has a new vehicle that frankly looks very similar to my Leaf, has about the same performance. It seems to be very similarly equipped. It's a little bit smaller. $12,000 new.
Wow.
$12,000. Right? So it's around the corner. They'll be cheaper up front.
A question on the heat pump, back to heat pumps. You know, we got one a few years ago, and the gas furnace hardly ever comes on now because it doesn't even click in until you get like 35 degrees, which is great. But I'm wondering, the other thing that never happened in the past was we never had air conditioning in the past. So we're spending more energy, which is coming out of a propane producing electricity plant probably, or that's now giving us air conditioning in the summer. So I'm wondering how that is trading off on the negative, right?
Well, there's no solution that doesn't involve us eliminating the use of fossil fuels to create electricity.
Right.
So the faster we clean up our electrical grid, the better. And we need to simultaneously be switching to more electricity-driven devices like electric vehicles, like heat pumps for heating our house, etc. Yeah, so that's definitely true.
On the electric cars, and this is kind of a statement, and I'd like to know if you agree with this, I happen to think it's one of the most low-hanging fruits for individual action, given we all need, most of us will buy a car anyway, that the electric cars is the one choice.
Your next car should be an electric vehicle.
Okay.
Yep. That's definitely a very positive thing you can do. And the sooner the better. So if you're kind of on the fence, go ahead and do it.
But can't you get solar panels less expensively than a new car?
Well, so solar panels in our particular area are probably not your best use of funds because we have a relatively low amount of solar energy and it's still relatively expensive to put a solar panel on a house, not because of the cost of the panel, but because of the cost of permitting and marketing and getting a crew out there and all of those things. It's the soft costs, they call it, not the panel costs, that are driving the cost of putting solar panels on homes. For example, in Australia, it costs less than half as much per kilowatt hour to put a solar panel on a roof. And they use the same panels we do. So it's other things. Dick?
We've had green power for 15 plus years, which in my mind is the same as putting solar panels or renewable energy in our yard, except it's someplace else. But I mean, that was a 5-minute decision on our electric bill to opt for.
Oh, you chose to, you checked the box on your electric bill to give Puget Sound Energy some extra money for green power?
To build windmills or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, well, they now, so in this state, the utilities are now required to reduce their emissions. And so they all got given orders to do it on a schedule. And so we have closed several coal plants and there are more closures still to come, I think. There's one in PSA has one over in Montana that I don't think is completely shut down. There are like 4 units and 2 of them are down. But that's coming. I think New England just closed its last coal plant. So it's happening. It's happening. Not fast enough, but it's happening. There's one point I wanted to make about this slide. So each of these sources of electricity has been priced out over its lifetime, and at a price per kilowatt hour and without subsidies. Although implicitly there's a subsidy for coal and gas because they don't get charged for the pollution associated with emissions. But the interesting thing to note is, not only that solar and wind are cheaper, that's been true for a while now, but there is the problem, of course, that the sun's not always shining, the wind's not always blowing. But if you note, solar plus storage has now become pretty much the default option when someone builds a solar plant or solar farm, and it's almost the same price as using fossil gas for producing electricity. But surprisingly, utilities continue to make major investments in gas power plants. And we'll talk in a moment about why and what has to change that.
Where was that? You didn't mention put hydro on that chart.
I didn't put hydro on it. There's not much more of it that we can build out.
Right, yeah, I just wonder what the cost per kilowatt hour is.
Well, it varies wildly.
Yeah.
So, but in general, hydropower is cheap. Yep. Once you build the dam, then continue to operate it is very low cost. I mean, that's why Washington has a built-in advantage, and we've actually attracted some industries to this area, like aluminum, like data centers out in the center part of the state, where in Chelan County, I think the cost of even a household power is like 3 cents a kilowatt hour. Here it's 10 or 11 here in this area. So yes, we have a built-in advantage with more cheap hydro than other parts of the country. Okay, next question is just 2 more. Unsubsidized utility scale solar electricity generation became cost competitive with fossil gas and cheaper than coal over 10 years ago. What percent of U.S. electricity is generated by solar power today? And your answers range from 4% up to 21%. Okay, pencils down? What do you think? What's the answer? 4%. 4% it is. Good. Yeah, it's kind of surprising, isn't it? It's been cheaper for 10 years and still pretty teeny tiny.
How does that compare with wind power in the US?
We have more wind. I didn't look up the number for that. I think it's probably something like 10 or 11%. There have been more utilities that have built wind farms. Wind became cheaper than other forms sooner than solar did, and it generally takes less space in total. The more of the space is vertical. So it seems kind of almost counterintuitive that it would be cheaper, and yet 10 years later we're still not using very much of it. But it just shows you how entrenched some of these trends are and how hard it is to get things to change. So I want to move forward to actually related to this. The principal point I wanted to make here is that the problem isn't that it's more costly to generate renewable electricity. The problem is that we can't seem to get more of it out there fast enough. And these days, it's the utilities that are holding things up. There are more renewable energy projects waiting to connect to the grid than twice the size of the existing electrical grid. It's just massive. The incentives we've almost overdone it on the incentives for adding renewable electricity, because we don't need more incentives. It's already cheaper. It's just hard to get the utilities to respond. They're slow moving bureaucracies, and we own them. It's up to us to get them to change. We can change the rules that utilities operate by. The time you have to wait now, on average, across the United States to get your a solar farm or a wind farm connected to the grid is over 5 years.
Oh, that's ridiculous.
It's incredible, but it's not the same everywhere. In Texas, it takes half the time it does in New England. And the principal reason is that they just decided to do things more efficiently in Texas. Instead of, so the way the utilities typically do this is say, you want to connect your solar farm to the grid. Well, now I have to go do a study of the whole grid and try and figure out, am I going to need new transmission lines? What are the environmental rules associated with building out more trenches? Do I need more generators? And that takes a long time. And it generally comes about with an answer that says, well, if you want to connect to the grid, you have to spend more money than it would cost for your entire project to upgrade the grid. We won't let you on the grid until you agree to make those investments. Even though everybody else could benefit from them too, they assign all the cost to one party. And so what naturally happens is that project fails. Then investors say, well, we're not going to do it now. They done things differently in Texas. They told people, okay, we'll connect you, but we may have to shut you down. And then the project owners say, well, how often might that happen? We think maybe 5% of the time, and they're like, okay, that's okay, we can make that work. So they connect, and yeah, they get shut down sometimes because we don't have the capacity to move the electrons to where they're needed. Dick?
Well, a few years ago, Texas had the big blackout.
Yeah.
Extended blackout because they weren't really interconnected with the broader grid, and I'm sure that probably motivated them to get their act together.
Well, no, that's a different issue, but that remains a problem. They're going to have more problems like that, and everyone should be more interconnected just because it allows you to be more resilient. It's unlikely the exact same, stress on the grid will happen in different places at exactly the same time. So if you can trade power and move the power from one point to another more effectively, then you'll have less blackouts.
I've heard in the past too, that people like the Obama Power Administration that basically shut down wind farms because they need to prioritize their own profits, being able to spill water on the dam, get power that way versus taking power from the wind farms. And so,
Sorry, who did that?
The Bonneville Power Administration, they're saying they basically shut down the wind farms, the independent wind farms. Now these guys are losing money because Bob said, we don't need your power. Thank you very much. We have to collect it from ourselves first.
Yeah.
And so it was.
There are incredibly complicated things that happen in our electrical system. It's a really complicated system and has lots of complicated rules. And one of the things I want to emphasize is that we can do better. Other places have done better. Like in the United Kingdom, they decided to change the rules and they transitioned a lot more quickly as a result. So in this country, the way utilities make money is to put steel in the ground, is really what it boils down to, because it's kind of a cost plus sort of system. They say we need to give you all reliable electricity that's affordable, so we have to have more transmission lines, more big centralized plants. So when they build one of those, they get whatever that cost is plus a profit margin. So naturally it pays, they make more profit if they build more stuff. They don't make more profit by being more efficient. They don't make more profit by not building things, by improving the electrical grid, for example, so that they don't have to build a transmission line or a new plant over there somewhere where population's growing. In the United Kingdom, in contrast, they changed the rules so that this started taking effect about 2013. The rules kind of changed the formula, so your revenue as a utility was a function of some specific incentives. So they give you more money for getting certain things done. They also paid you for innovating, and they paid you for hitting certain targets. So when you rolled all that up, it resulted in the utility just said, okay, those are the new rules, let's go get it done. And the United Kingdom reduced their consumption of coal dramatically over 10 years. The electrical grid used to be 80% powered by coal, and now it's less than 5%. It's about to go to zero. right? And that happened over about a 10-year period. So it can happen. And at this time, I looked this up the other day, their share of renewable electricity is about twice what it is here. And so that's the power of the incentives in that utility system. Okay, last question now. This is a hard one. I'll give you a little extra time.
Jeff, are you going to read it?
Are you gonna read it?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't read the question. In 2022, the Biden administration passed the first major federal legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, to drive the transition to a clean energy economy. Which important federal clean energy policies were not addressed in the IRA? So you have to, I'm asking for which things weren't a part of the IRA. All right, pencils down. So, any volunteers to tell me which ones they decided were not part of the Inflation Reduction Act? Okay, this table right here.
Us over here?
Yeah. No. Yeah. Don, what did your table come up with?
We thought perhaps E was one of them.
Yeah.
E. E is one of them. Yes, there are two more.
And C.
How about H?
H.
H. Yes, H is one of them. And what was the last one? Someone said. C is the third. So
Okay.
three things that are important policies for accelerating a transition to a clean energy economy were not addressed in the Inflation Reduction Act. You may recall there was at one point a big push to pass the Build Back Better Act, and that sort of fell by the wayside. And in that, the E was definitely a big feature of it. So that didn't happen in the IRA, and there really wasn't much relating to speeding up transmission lines either, although there is some activity now to try and improve our regulations to make it possible to build transmission more quickly.
What was the third one? E, H, and C.
So the ones that were not included were C, E, and H.
But G was, does that technology, I wasn't aware of that technology.
Yeah, there's the USDA got money to pay farmers to do things like cover cropping and to stop tilling the soil, and those changes result in more soil organic carbon being accumulating over time. All right, so we have a lot of really important policies that have been implemented now, and we have a lot of solutions. The big problem is we're just not getting it done, right? But some other countries are, and one of them in particular is leading the whole transition to a clean energy economy. What I've got displayed here is the share of activity on five measures for China, the European Union, and the US. First one's battery production, the amount of electric batteries that they're producing in the country. The second is solar panels. Frankly, China dominates the solar panel industry in the world. EV production, they're leading there as well. They've rolled out more green hydrogen capacity recently than anyone else, than we have, or than the EU has. And they've rolled out more renewable electricity production, more solar plants, more wind farms. They also have more coal plants than anyone, right? And the reason they have those things, there's two big reasons. One is their system, when their economy started to switch from being mostly agrarian to more urban and industrialized, was entirely driven by coal plants. We had more hydropower, we had more nuclear power in particular. They just were behind and they missed that whole wave. Well, they've been catching up now, but at the same time, we like to buy stuff that they make. And whenever they make it, it takes energy. And so in order to meet our demand for goods, they they're not going to just let that business go to some other country because they need the jobs, they need the income. And so they're building out coal plants where they have to in order to meet our demand for their goods. So, when it really all comes back to your individual carbon footprint. If we continue to be 9 times the output per person of greenhouse gas emissions relative to the 60% of the world that lives below the equator, we're not going to change fast enough to avert a crisis. So I want to wrap up now because it's about time for service. We absolutely know how to meet that goal that the IPCC set of reducing our emissions 50% by 2030. We have all the tools. We can be a lot more energy efficient. Countries like Japan and Germany per person use about half the amount of energy that the United States does or that Canada does. We can use a lot more clean electricity. We're starting to do that. That's definitely happening. But in general, we still have work to do to clean up our grid. We can convert most of our uses of energy to electricity. Cars, driving your car, heating your homes, all of those things can be converted. There are changes we need to make to our food system. We didn't talk about that today, but between the amount of food that gets wasted and the amount of food that is grown in ways that actually involve greenhouse gas emissions being emitted, there's a lot we could do to improve in our food production system. And then we know how to protect natural carbon sinks. We just have to decide to do it, right? We have forests, we have croplands that could have things grown on them rather than being bare. 92% of the acres in the Midwest are bare during the winter. And that has all sorts of environmental problems associated with it. And there are a lot of places where the soil is still just regularly tilled, and that increases the amount of carbon dioxide that gets released. And then we put a lot of fertilizer down, and fertilizer interacts with the air to release nitrous oxide, which is a potent greenhouse gas. So there is a lot we can do right now with the tools we have, and we'll be better off for it. We'll be healthier, we'll save money. It's generally there's no downside to doing these things that are on that list. There are some tools we need that we don't yet have, but they're coming. We need alternatives, liquid fuel alternatives to fossil fuel-based power sources for things like planes and heavy industrial uses. We need more materials that are low carbon. Concrete, steel, aluminum, fiberglass, glass, all of those materials that we use in buildings and in other places have greenhouse gas emissions associated with making them. And we need alternatives that are neutral or potentially even store carbon in them. Wood inherently stores carbon in it. And then finally, we have to learn how to create artificial carbon sinks. We've gone too far. We actually have to figure out how to dial the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere down, which involves taking more out of the atmosphere. And we do have some technologies that are in development. They are quite expensive still. They can't be done on a big enough scale to solve the problem. So there's one more thing that we have to do that I think that we haven't, many people have hesitated to think about this until now, and that is geoengineering. These are major experiments to try and either reflect solar radiation back out into space so it doesn't get to Earth, maybe like massive, reflective surfaces strung up above the Earth, or aerosols being put in the air that reflect that energy back, which is what happens with pollution. So you can put more sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere and it'll reduce the amount of solar radiation that gets through to the Earth, but it has consequences, and we don't really know what those consequences are. All of those ideas have really unexplored consequences at this point. So we need to research them because it might become necessary to use. I would frankly say, I would guess at this point, it will become necessary to do some of those things at significant scale. if we're going to avert catastrophic levels of change.
What would happen if everybody made the roof white with plexi?
I'm sorry, if everybody did what?
Made their roof white with plexi.
Well, there are cities where they're doing some of that. The primary thing, though, it does is just reduces the amount of heat in the city itself. It's not really something that can be done at a big enough scale to matter. Not compared to, for example, ice melting in the Arctic Ocean or glaciers retreating and snow caps declining. That's happening at much bigger scale. Well, that's what I wanted to share today. I'd ask you to leave, whoever was scribe, if you could bring your sheet up here for me, I would appreciate that. I'm just kind of curious what people thought. And then next week we will do our individual climate action plans. So I hope to see you again next week.